Welcome everybody to the podcast. I don't really have a name necessarily for this podcast. I do have a title for this specific episode, as this is a standalone episode of this podcast. This podcast is called James Madison, An Ambiguous Legacy. So we're going to be kind of diving into all things wishy-washy about James Madison today. My name is Mackenzie Mason, and I'm here with Matthew Luther, aka Matt Luther. Let me just go ahead and introduce Matt. Matt is a native of Chesterfield, Virginia. He graduated from William & Mary in 2019 with a bachelor's degree in history and a second major in government. He is currently pursuing an MA in history with a concentration in public history at James Madison University, just like myself, except I'm not public history. His research interests include U.S., European, and military history, and his master's thesis focuses on military training at colleges and universities in Virginia during World War I. For myself, I didn't really write out anything specifically, but my name is Mackenzie Mason. I'm from Franklin County, Virginia, Rocky Mount more specifically. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2021 from UVA-Wise in Wise County, Virginia. And with a history degree, and I'm here at JMU getting my master's just in regular U.S. history, not public like Matt. And my thesis topic includes elite upper-class African-American women during the 20th century. So kind of definitely coming from two different backgrounds a little bit, but hopefully we'll kind of talk about some interesting things during this podcast, and I think it'll go well. I chose Matt for a couple of reasons for this podcast specifically. Matt is a public history student at JMU, and I felt like that would be really great for this podcast, as you'll see in just a second. So for this project, this is the final research project in this course for Dr. Brandon's class that I am in. Matt is not in the class, but I am. I just pulled him in to be on this project with me. I decided to focus on what will be a public-facing research project, this podcast, on James Madison. My intention is to create what I'm calling an academic parody on the very common Am I the Asshole, also abbreviated AITA, Reddit source podcast. So in these podcasts, the host usually reads an anonymous submission which describes a situation or a string of circumstances in which the author is not really sure whether or not they are being an asshole. After reading the submission, the host will discuss the situation with guests on the show, so that's kind of the purpose as to why Matt is here today. Each guest, or the host and the guests, provide kind of unique perspectives on the events described in the submission in an easy conversational format. After spending a significant amount of time kind of dissecting that post, the host and the guest decide the fate of the original poster, which is commonly abbreviated to OP. Whether the OP is declared the asshole or not the asshole, the host and guest consider ways in which OP could have handled the situation better. In this case, for the academic parody intention of this project, it will be extremely similar to what I have described. Really the only difference is, instead of using an anonymous post from Reddit to discuss, I have written and will provide a first-person perspective narrative from James Madison's point of view on both the good and the bad of his life. After reading this initial first-person narrative about Madison, Matt and I will address main issues and themes surrounding the man who was the father of the Constitution, the fourth president of the United States of America. He was a slaveholder, commander-in-chief during wartime, and namesake of the university in which we both attend, James Madison University. Discussing the problems with his plantation, Montpelier, would be my ideal way to end this podcast. I have some questions loaded up about that. So all of these questions that we will address kind of after I read this first-person narrative from Madison, and I'm excited. I think it'll go really well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Really quick before we get started, just a disclaimer about the whole podcast and the intention of what we're doing here today. The purpose of this podcast is not for two JMU students to call any president of the United States an asshole. specifically one who designed the Constitution of the United States, in which we live under and have rights under. So, this is really just a discussion of ways in which Madison's legacy should be discussed in the public history field, and ways it can be improved, I think, in a large part. And as JMU students, I feel like we're really good people to be able to speak on that in a lot of ways. So, are you ready? You ready for this?
Let's do it.
Okay. So the title, right? The title is very important. AITA for passively allowing the Constitution of the United States to enshrine racial slavery.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay. The concept of owning, purchasing, and allowing slavery to exist in the United States was, for the record, not my idea. Indentured servitude and African slavery existed in the colonies long before my birth at Belle Grove in 1751. Regardless, I certainly had a hand in the continuation or perpetuation of the evil institution, which is the sole purpose of this quest, to discover if I am the asshole or not. The story really begins at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where I was tasked with writing extensive notes on the everyday arguments and conversations which took place in that notorious room in Philadelphia. I am fairly shy and soft-spoken, so I felt this was a good use of my abilities. The delegates at the convention presumed from the start that this new national government would not be allowed to interfere directly with slavery in states where it already existed. There were some true pro-slavery delegates present who were troubled by the recent enactments of gradual abolition laws in the North and feared the possibility of this new government emancipating their slaves. Because of this, the pro-slavery delegates, led by men from South Carolina, typical, demanded any type of protections they could receive, at the very least making it impossible for the government to enact anything concerning slavery without slave-holding states' consent. Although we collectively decided that it would be up to the states to safeguard their property rights in slaves, the pro-slavery delegates could not guarantee slavery's future within the Constitution, a document I was primarily in charge of designing. However, together we drew a line against acknowledging slavery's legitimacy outside of state law. I even intervened at one point. When there was a push to approve a line about property and man in the Constitution, I felt it necessary to both oppose and exclude this idea that there could be property in man in the document. If we, had approved this line, there could have possibly been huge consequences. In my own academic life, I was intellectually inspired by my closest of friends, Thomas Jefferson, as well as the Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu, among other Enlightenment ideology. If the Constitution had explicitly stated this idea of property in man, it would have been a terrible violation of the egalitarian principles of the American Revolution, such as the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even Jefferson did not completely plagiarize Locke, as he conveniently left out the people's right to property in his list of grievances to the king. Acknowledging enslaved individuals as property potentially could have corrupted this country from the get-go. Unfortunately, my remark about excluding the provision of man as property was adopted by anti-slavery writings later in the 1840s and 1850s, even though I myself was neither anti-slavery nor abolition-minded. So that's the first section of the letter, of this letter. So we're going to go ahead and kind of dive into some of the things addressed in there. I guess the first thing that we can talk about definitely from that is, to what extent would Madison as well as the other founders, like, how do you think they would have struggled with prioritizing nation building and kind of this growth of a national economy through capitalism versus outlawing slavery, like within the late 18th century?
Right.
Because I feel like, in Dr. Brandon's class, we talked a lot about, the economy of the nation really getting started through mercantilism in the beginning of the 1700s, and how the switch to capitalism and a national economy, really made them not want to free the enslaved people within the country. So I guess coming from your government background, I guess what are your thoughts on that, if you have any?
I mean, it's an interesting debate an interesting debate to think about. During the Revolution, they had a hard enough time getting enough men together for the Continental Army because the states operated independently.
Oh, right.
So, Washington really was fighting and pushing for a unified force in order to fight the British, and a lot of the state governors didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see the same problems pop up once the Revolution is over with, and now they're trying to form a government. You've got, really at this point, the United States isn't really like a single country. It's like a confederation of different, smaller countries. So I can, on the one hand, I can see like the prioritization of a national economy in order to strengthen the country, because while the British were defeated, there's a good possibility that they would come back. Not to foreshadow anything, but War of 1812 is a couple decades away.
Right, which Madison is at the helm of.
Right.
Yeah.
So I can see the need to prioritize this economy. Like, we're a news nation, we have to establish ourselves somehow. But on the other hand, you do have people being treated as property and not given the same rights as others. And some of the enslaved population fought for the Revolution. So it's a tough debate, and I can kind of see why they kicked the can down the road in the Constitution. Like, we can't deal with this right now, we can't come to a consensus, so that's a problem for future Americans to deal with.
Right. Kind of going back to something you said earlier about how they weren't even a unified country really at this point, and more just like a true confederation of states. This was a big problem at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 because it was so hard to get them really to agree on anything. So, when we think about the framers kind of allowing the tolerance of slavery at the time, I wonder too if it was just because they had bigger fish to fry, not only with the national economy, but also just with, because Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellions were also going on at the same time. So they were really stressed not only about slave rebellions at the time, but also just, poor white people having, particularly in the army, having those same issues with rebellions. And so I feel like they really prioritized the Caucasian rebellions at the time.
Yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of those rebellions was veterans of the Revolution rebelling because they were not paid properly.
Yes.
Yeah, when you have an armed militia who has just fought the preeminent power in Europe and has won, and they are angry and they have firearms and they have the knowledge and tactics to use them, that's a big problem for a new state, or for a new nation.
Yes.
So I can see it does make sense. All right, we've got armed white men who know how to use these rifles and muskets running around causing havoc. Like, that's not something you can put off for a couple months. Like,
no, I agree with you.
But to your point of bigger fish to fry, I definitely think that, at least in their minds, I can see the kind of the need to prioritize which fire to put out first, so to speak.
And that wasn't even their only fire, really, to put out. Maybe when it comes to military issues or, true rebellions at the time. But, they also had other countries kind of breathing down their neck. Spain is still a pretty large presence, in southern United States, in western United States. France, at the time, still has, Louisiana territory, pretty much. And, France is one of their allies, but they're not necessarily on the greatest of terms, I would say, at this point in time.
No, and the French Revolution is right around the corner, too.
Right.
Like, the French king is going to get his head chopped off in a couple of years, so... the French monarchy bankrupts themselves, essentially, to help the United States. Because in an effort to spite the British, which has been a long pastime of the French, they're going to do whatever they can to make the British unhappy. So, they still have the Louisiana Purchase and French Canada as well.
Oh, true.
And then also the British territories in Canada. That will come into play with the War of 1812 as well.
Yeah.
So you're right. They are kind of surrounded on all fronts by European powers who might not be the most willing to negotiate.
Yeah. And, Germany doesn't really have any colonies in the Americas at the point, but they did aid the British, did they not? Like during the Revolutionary War?
There were German units, particularly the Hessians, in Trenton, New Jersey, which Washington crossed Delaware with on Christmas Eve and caught them by surprise.
It's one of my favorite stories from the Revolutionary War.
It's fantastic. But like you said, at this point there is no unified Germany. There's still kind of a conglomerate of German states and the Holy Roman Empire, but that will kind of get dissolved within the next few decades. But yeah, mostly it's France, Britain, and Spain. And
not a lot of allies for the United States, neither.
No.
Maybe France, but it doesn't really stay like that for long.
No.
They're only really lucky that Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin are such good advocates for the United States within France at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. Very interesting. It's very interesting to think about, I know like every history book on the American Revolution kind of breaks down the plethora of issues that the founders were kind of dealing with at the time. This is kind of, putting it back into perspective for me a little bit. Just, probably how nervous they were really to start anything. And even, something I tell my students a lot when we talk about the American Revolution is that, there are more loyalists than a lot of American history classes like to admit at the time, because this is treason, right? Like all of the founders, if they if they had lost, not to do what if history, but if they had lost, they all would have been hanged for treason. Like it's a very serious thing that they were doing, and I'm sure, like, I cannot imagine how much stress they must have been under at the time.
Yeah.
So, you are a public historian, hopefully looking for a job in the public history sphere in a couple of months.
Oh, gosh, don't remind me.
And I know that you probably won't be working with American Revolution things. Probably more World War I would assume.
Ideally, early 20th century, but I'll take a job wherever I can get one.
Right. I totally understand that. I have not even done a single application yet, but that's okay. Or I guess not. Yeah, job application. I haven't done one yet. But I guess coming from your public history background and, your plans to go into a job where you have to deal with, certain histories that maybe people don't want to learn about. Right. When we think about the framers, the founders of this country, admitting in fundamental documents of our history, not necessarily acknowledging the idea of property of man, yet perpetuating and allowing for the institution of slavery to continue into the new republic. Does this, or should this knowledge change the way historians teach American history to the general public? And I know, like, ages may be difficult, like, maybe not children, but when we think about, like, adults, should historians talk more about this, in public history spaces?
I definitely think it's important for these topics to be acknowledged. Your question about ages is a good point as well. I'm not sure elementary schoolers are going to want to discuss the legality of owning other people,
Right.
But I definitely think it needs to be discussed, because unfortunately there seems to be kind of an assumption by people who aren't as familiar with history that it's very black and white, when in fact it's mostly shades of gray. And it seems that once people get through high school, or maybe their like introductory history courses in college, that's all they do. They don't read on their own. They don't learn on their own. And it's a tough thing to do, to try to kind of distill all of the knowledge that American citizens should know about the history of their nation into a single semester or 2 semesters, depending on the course system. But having some discussion of that, while the Constitution is the most vital document to the United States today, there were some flaws in the system. Trying to cover everything, from the Revolution to the present, or I don't know how colleges are breaking up the courses now, but there needs to be some sort of discussion of at least understanding why the Constitution is framed the way it is. And, I think what we did before, like, they've got fires going everywhere pretty much. They got a lot of stuff they got to cover.
Right.
So I definitely think that there needs to be more discussion of this. The question is, how do you do it? I don't want to jump the gun, but I know when people go to like Mount Vernon or Montpelier or Monticello, a lot of visitors go there because they want to learn about Jefferson or Madison or Washington, and they don't necessarily want to learn about their flaws.
Right.
So that's something that public historians have been working to kind of fix and alter their programming. Definitely not an overnight thing, but from what I've read about and what I've seen, it seems to be trending in the direction of acknowledging that the founding fathers were people, and they had flaws, and they didn't do things perfectly.
Right.
So.
And as we continue on today, we will find out that James Madison was a very flawed individual, like many of us are, of course. But he definitely does have that, or have some of those darker spots in his history. I think if I was going to give my thoughts, I should probably give my thoughts. I think it's amazing to learn about kind of this time period in history, particularly because you have all of these men who, they're elite white men with a lot of money, a lot of political power at the time, but they want to do something to change, their representation in government. And James Madison is about 29 years old, actually, at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, so he's really young. Mm-hmm. He's actually pretty close to your age.
He's only about 3 or 4 years older than I am right now.
Right. So when we think about, I can't even imagine being in a room with 100 or so other men who are, many years older than myself, who probably are more confident and more... aware of their power in the room more so than Madison probably was at the time. It's difficult to place all the blame on him when it comes to the Constitution and the 3/5 clause stating that African Americans could be counted as 3/5 of a person, which benefited the slaveholders in the South particularly. It's obviously not his fault, and he should not really be blamed for that necessarily. If compromises at a political level, like, I don't know, you can't necessarily blame one individual, one person for that.
Right.
So.
Especially with something as high stakes as this, like, compromise is going to have to happen in order for anything to get done.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So I think, if we were to judge him just on this section, I think, unfortunately, while he did allow for the perpetuation of the institution, it's not necessarily his fault alone.
Right.
And while he was a slave owner at the time, we'll get to that in the next section. While he was a slave owner at the time, he advocated for not putting the property of man element within the Constitution, which if that had been allowed to happen, who knows what would have happened. So maybe he actually blocked something for the betterment of the United States at the time. So, yeah. All right.
Okay.
All right.
Part
the second.
Part the second. So verdict right now, Madison, not really an asshole.
Yeah. So, I guess a little tiny summary before we get started for the next section. Madison, I think he's just trying to do his best.
Yeah, he's struggling.
Yeah, keep in mind, like, right after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, like, he really starts his, like, huge writing career, like, because he starts writing the Federalist Papers, really aligns himself with his close friend Thomas Jefferson, and kind of, I think it's so interesting because Madison is such an interesting character. I feel like we don't read enough about him or, like, learn enough about him. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the last section and talk about his legacy. But he lives till he's 85.
Wow.
So his political career for the time is so long. Like, I feel like it's similar to Ben Franklin's, like, very lengthy political career.
Yeah.
Yet everyone talks about Ben Franklin, and I feel like not enough people really talk about James Madison, because his career, his political career, is just as influential to the early republic as Ben Franklin, if not more influential, because of his work in the Constitution. So, going into this next section, we're going to talk about, I guess, Madison's, confrontation with slavery, and how he acquired his plantation Montpelier, and that'll really take us to kind of the next section of his life, I feel like. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Regardless, I guess one could potentially argue that allowing the 3/5 compromise enlarged the slaveholders' power in national politics. Also, I suppose one could also argue that allowing slavery to continue where it existed constitutes as the same thing as giving sanction to it. Additionally, we only ever evaded the discussion of what would happen to new territories in the West and whether slavery would be allowed in the expansion of the new nation. We really did nothing to limit the potential growth in power of the slaveholding states in the South, but I suppose I technically benefited from that as well. I did indeed own a tobacco plantation in Orange County, Virginia, where I possessed about 100 enslaved individuals. Now, before you get started, you cannot necessarily blame me. I only inherited the grounds of Montpelier, which was one of the largest plantations in eastern Virginia at the time, from my father, James Madison Sr. My close friend and confidant, Thomas Jefferson, also owns his own plantation, Monticello, in Albemarle County, a mere 33 miles from me. We visit each other whenever we can. I consider him such a good friend that I actually keep portraits of him, not just in my study, but also in my dining room. To be fair, many people do not know I held slaves. Jefferson takes most of the pressure off the rest of us founders when it comes to that subject. To be fair, it is a slight misconception that I did not grow my wealth through enslaved peoples in my lifetime. The last inventory notes from my grandfather, Ambrose Madison, indicated that he only owned 29 African Americans in 1732. After nearly a century of births, deaths, purchases, and sales, nearly 120 enslaved people supported my small family. I suppose it does not help my image that I refused to free a single slave before my death or even in my will. After my death at a nearly ancient age of 85, my wife Dolly sold my estate and many members of the enslaved community. I must mention, however, that she deeded some of my slaves to her son from her first marriage. Her son's name is Mr. John Payne Todd, and she took a small number with her when she moved to Washington, D.C. Overall, 6 generations of African Americans, or about 300 individuals in total, were held as property by my family. So, after that section, I feel like, not a lot of people know, I guess, just right off the bat, not a lot of people are aware, I guess, that Madison inherited a lot of his wealth. I guess one could assume that. Like, I know a lot of historians probably could assume that James Madison inherited a lot of his wealth from his family. But I feel like the average American does not know that.
Yeah.
And even knowing that Montpelier was, at the time of, him inheriting it from his father, James Madison Sr., it was the largest plantation, in eastern Virginia, which is kind of insane if you think about it, because it didn't have that many slaves on it at the time. But slavery really progressed, I feel like, in Virginia, particularly in the 19th century, the early 19th century.
Yeah.
But anyway. So I guess one of the themes for this section is definitely Madison's friendship with Thomas Jefferson. As a main actor in early American history, James Madison is generally considered a contradictory figure due to both his title as father of the Constitution and the reality of where his wealth derives from. It's very similar to his close friend Thomas Jefferson. Of course, higher academia discusses this issue, right? We talk a lot in our graduate classes about these founding fathers owning slaves, yet being, great icons of American history.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how important is it for the average American to really know that information, or to know that contradictory history? And I guess at the time, does it really matter that Americans revere the Constitution, yet they don't read it or know it? And still today, a lot of Americans don't really read the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
I had to memorize it in high school, unfortunately. But that's private school things. But I guess, is enough being done to kind of reckon with this contradictory history, and how as educators, because I'm sure you in your job in the future, you kind of will be a public educator.
Yeah.
And myself as well. I'm licensed to educate in the state of Virginia. So how can we better deal with this contradictory history, especially pertaining to Jefferson and Madison?
Yeah. To the first part of your question, I don't think Americans know that there's this sort of weird dichotomy between father of the Constitution and slaveholder.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough job for anybody because, at least in my experience, people today have a tendency to project 21st century values back onto history.
Right.
And if you do that, hardly anybody's going to pass the eye test, you know. So it's tough. On the one hand, you have to try to tell people, like, when these people were alive, when the founders were alive, owning other human beings was not seen as a social negative.
Right.
It was acceptable. Today, I don't think there'd be a single person in America who would agree that should still be the case, but it's tough because I see a lot of people, they want to go entirely negative or entirely positive when it comes to talking about historical figures, particularly Madison and Jefferson, So it's it's walking this tightrope of acknowledging what they did for the country, but also acknowledging that they, like we talked about before, they were flawed people. They had bad ideas. What can be done to help educate the public? That's a tough one. I mean, because like in class, people have said, who have worked at public sites have said that people come only to hear one part of the story. They want to come hear about Madison writing the Constitution or Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, and they don't really care that about the stories of the enslaved individuals. I don't know too much about what Montpelier is doing, but I know
we'll talk about it.
Okay. I know that Monticello is trying to bring the narratives of the enslaved people kind of back into the limelight, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think, kind of going off of your point from earlier as well, like, a lot of people, my students included, want to be able to look at history in that black and white, like you were mentioning earlier, when, in reality, like, humans just are all shades of gray. And really to understand, like, any historical figure, whether it's Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968 or whether it's James Madison, in 1800, we really, I feel like as public educators have to kind of explicitly state that they're not perfect people, just like the rest of us. They're not perfect people. And I think also kind of going along with what you were saying, I think particularly at Montpelier, there's kind of like this negative connotation with going to see the mere distinction of color exhibit. So Montpelier, for those of you listening, and for Matt, who maybe have you visited? You haven't visited.
I haven't visited.
You haven't visited. I know you have some concept from class last semester or last year. For Dillard's class, I did a presentation on Montpelier. But you can go visit the house. It's $35 per person to go tour the house. And when it's a tour of the house, it's a tour of 4 rooms in the house. And then You can kind of view grounds. Montpelier is very secluded from the rest of Orange County. Mm-hmm. It's not really like Thomas Jefferson's, because Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is kind of like on top of that hill, right? And you can see a lot of Charlottesville, a lot of Albemarle County from the top of his house. Montpelier is like hidden in kind of like this wooded area. And so I don't think it was meant to be as public as Monticello.
No.
But also Madison was just more of a shy character, more secluded. He spent actually most of his time after his presidency just in his house scribbling away, because he was a little introverted man. And so you can go tour the house, but it's only 4 rooms that you can see. And then, of course, you can tour grounds. You can see like where the enslaved people would live in these cabins, like to the side. And then, of course, you can go down into the Mere Distinction of Color exhibit, which is in the basement of Montpelier. And they have lots of artifacts from the enslaved population that lived there. They have some stories from the enslaved population that lived there, and you know, I think it's difficult to kind of really to know that Madison was clearly not, you know, a champion of the institution of slavery. I actually have a couple of quotes that I should probably pull up. One moment. From Madison, because he wrote, of course, a lot in his life. One of his letters to his friend Edmund Randolph in 1785, he says, "Another one of my wishes is to depend as little as possible on the labor of slaves." And a second quote that Madison says in his published work, Vices of the Political System of the United States, published 2 years later in 1787, he says, "Where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more fallacious." So it's so interesting to kind of look at Madison, this figure who, you know, clearly does not want the institution of slavery really talked about in the Constitution. In his letters, he writes, you know, how slavery and republicanism can't really coexist within the same country. And he did, you know, him and Jefferson were part of the Democratic Republic Party, kind of in the early portions of American history, or in the history of America. And so this is kind of when I personally feel like James Madison starts becoming this really ambiguous character. Like, and this is kind of my argument for the podcast, for this general project, is that he just becomes kind of after the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He really becomes this very wishy-washy character, and you know, we start to see, which I'll explain in the next section, these issues of what a lot of historians call the Madison problem, where he just goes very back and forth on hard issues. He doesn't really stay in one spot on an issue. He will go back and forth on it. There are specific instances of that, which we'll talk about when we get to his presidency. But I feel like this is definitely one as well. It is also worth adding that one possible reason he did not set his slaves free at the end of his lifetime is that he died very broke. This is pretty stereotypical of a lot of founding fathers, actually, at the time. I think Thomas Jefferson, to my knowledge, also died.
I think so.
Pretty broke as well. But he left his wife, Dolly, very little to live on after he passed, and both of them knew it. She actually kind of lived on in poverty at the end of her life, unfortunately. She was several years younger than he was. So, kind of additionally, I guess I've been talking about how Madison made it clear that he opposed slavery when it comes to like Republican principles, yet he still owned slaves kind of throughout his entire lifetime. He also opposed the African slave trade throughout his entire career, yet late in life he defended the westward expansion of slavery. And again, he regularly attacked slavery as a violation of these Republican principles, but he never put anything forward for like a realistic program to kind of eradicate the institution. And this is kind of the very beginnings of this Madison problem, how his life, right, is so lengthy. His political career is so lengthy. And I know you may not have the perfect answer for this type of question, but as a historian, and even one, we're both working on thesis projects right now that have really nothing to do with this, but still when we, put our thinking caps on to kind of, when we try to deal with, history that's not pretty sometimes. Yeah. I mean, can you see why historians have had such a difficult time trying to figure out like a narrative when it comes to James Madison's history, particularly with slavery, and even like, I guess how would you take a crack at it if you had to?
Yeah, I feel like historians, we like to, a little like scientists, like to categorize things. So if we can say that this person was definitely an abolitionist or this person was definitely pro-slavery, that makes our jobs easier. But having not studied a whole lot about James Madison, I can already feel the frustration of historians who specialize in this time period. Because Madison, from what you've been saying, he can't pick a side and stick with it. He kind of flip-flops back and forth, and if I had to take a crack at being a Madison historian, I don't know what you could say. It almost seems like you need to do like a bit of like a psychological profile to see if there's some underlying thing, like in his personal life. Is he this wishy-washy, or is it just his political life? And it could be that he doesn't really have a firm stance one way or the other, or he's one of those people that whatever idea is presented last is the one he goes with. Yeah, so definitely. If I was writing a book about Madison, I think the best way to go about it was just flat out say he's wishy-washy. He can't stick with an argument. Like you said, he's calling for the abolition of the slave trade, but doesn't give any sort of concrete plan or even an idea of a plan to ban it. So
right. And I think, a lot of like authors, a lot of historians on this time period say that like he was just, although he said that he despised it, he was just worried about the integrity of the country holding together. And I feel like all the founders felt that pressure. Of course, who wouldn't feel that pressure? But it's actually interesting because it was difficult for me to find like a really good biography on Madison, because of all these issues that I've kind of laid out. And of course my historiography and my sources will be listed at the end of this podcast. But one of kind of an interesting source, an interesting monograph where I found some information from, and we've already mentioned her today, but it was on Dolly Madison. It was a monograph on Dolly. It was called A Perfect Union, Dolly Madison and the Creation of an American Nation by Catherine Alger. And, Dr. Alger talks about how Dolly is really considered a celebrity of the founding generation. She was very popular, but she had a lot of enemies. And her enemies circulated a lot of rumors that Thomas Jefferson had sold her sexual services. And they even attacked her as Queen Dolly for her just how she carried herself. She was a very beautiful woman, which was interesting because James Madison was like 4'11". He was very short, very quiet, and she was just this very beautiful, very extroverted person. But in this monograph, it talks about how Dolly kind of gives this new republic what it needed for the develop of this an interesting political culture, because Dolly really, like, during his presidency is seen as like one of the main politicians in a way of the White House at the time. She had a lot of charisma, and she had an essential role during Madison's time as president. Actually, the man who lost in the 1808 election to James Madison, he actually wrote that he was beaten by Mr. and Mrs. Madison, and said that he might have had a better chance if he had faced Mr. Madison alone. So it's interesting to kind of look at that and look at how both of them together kind of create this really interesting political situation. And even recently, some historians have compared James and Dolly to the Clintons' presidency in the 1990s. The fact that they were just such a duo together, and kind of comparing Dolly to Hillary's political role within the White House and as First Lady, which is very interesting. Of course, there's that really famous story of Dolly Madison saving the portrait of Washington from the White House when the British caught it on fire in the War of 1812. So she's this really, I think she adds a lot to his presidency and adds a lot to even just his life and just role as a as a famous Virginian. So I guess, did you learn a lot about Dolly in school?
Only that she saved the portrait of Washington. Really? Not much. We didn't learn a lot about Madison for the most part. We did a lot of Jamestown visits. It was closer to go to Jamestown than Monticello or Montpelier, but most of the Virginia founders, the sons of the Commonwealth that we learned about were Washington, obviously, and Jefferson. A little bit about Madison, but not too much. It's interesting that they made the comparison between James and Dolly and Bill and Hillary. I was thinking about FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, interesting.
Because she did a lot of political work behind the scenes and in the White House as well.
Yeah, you're right. I think, and I think maybe one difference from Eleanor to Dolly is that I think Dolly was definitely if James Madison did not like the institution of slavery, I think Dolly enjoyed the luxuries that it gave her. And the book talks about this a lot as well. And of course she took a couple slaves with her, of course, back to Washington, D.C. after James Madison's death. And I always wonder if perhaps, James Madison didn't really work on getting rid of slavery within his lifetime because he knew it was such an institution, and even his own wife and himself, that they both benefited from it in a lot of ways, of course. And I guess, I don't know.
That is something interesting. It would definitely take a person of strong character to kneecap themselves financially in order to stand up for what's morally right. So,
right. And as morally right, I think as Madison thought of himself, clearly not morally right enough.
It would be tough for him to work the plantation by himself. So
yeah, I agree.
We're talking about kind of one of the biggest hypocrisies of Madison's life. It seems like he's very, on one day he's very anti-slavery, the next day he's very pro-slavery, and his wife, I kind of get the impression that she was a bit of a socialite.
Yes.
And so to kind of keep his wife in that luxurious lifestyle, he needs enslaved workers.
Yeah.
So I think you ask good questions.
Okay, good. And definitely that it's also so important to kind of look at the American Revolution from a class perspective.
Yes.
I feel like I didn't even get that in college when I went to undergrad. It was not taught like that. It was still kind of taught like how we learned it in high school, I feel like. But Definitely coming to grad school, taking Brandon's course, it's much more of a class issue than I thought previously. You know, the elite class of these founding fathers, I mean, I don't think even one of them like came from the working class.
No, I mean, just look who came from Virginia. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison all had substantial plantations.
Right.
Like, you don't have, Joe Smith who works down at the docks in Norfolk,
Right. And then, I mean, Patrick Henry, you could probably say is the most working class, although he still had quite a bit of wealth at the time. He's also just an interesting character as well.
Yes.
Wish Michael was here to talk about.
We need Michael. Give us a quick rundown about Patrick Henry.
Unfortunately, most of my personal and political career has been declared problematic by those who study my career. The Madison problem has been studied by many throughout the decades, but I think it is difficult to truly come to a conclusion on the subject. While yes, I was an advocate of national power in the 1780s, I technically championed states' rights later in the 1790s. I wavered on this topic again while president in 1816 when I signed legislation to create a federally chartered central bank. After I retired, I did admit that I changed my mind frequently on where I stood in the argument of a national bank, but I think I was fundamentally consistent. My core beliefs never changed, including preserving majority rule, minority rights, and the balance of power between the branches and levels of government. The issues changed, not me. Most historians place me, ideological speaking, solidly in between the nationalist Hamilton and Republican Jefferson. I will say it is difficult to come to any real logical conclusion about my beliefs, mostly due to the fact that I was a working statesman over the course of a long career which lasted several decades. As power shifted between national and local authority, I simply had to adjust my views. Tell me about one individual whose beliefs never fluctuated over the course of their entire life, and I will decidedly concede in this effort to save my name and legacy. So tell me, am I the asshole? So this Madison problem, as we've kind of touched around, this entire podcast, it's really that Madison not only fluctuated over the issue of slavery throughout his entire career, but also fluctuated with whether he, was a proponent of national versus states power, particularly during his presidency. Madison also served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and he was kind of embroiled in these various struggles during the early United States, and had, constant warfare kind of between England and France. The first time he was elected president was in 1808, as previously mentioned, and then he was re-elected in 1812, kind of shockingly, because he never really did anything of substance during his presidency, and he even most of the bills that he sent to Congress, they never really voted on. In fact, many of them they just sent back to him because there was really nothing to work with. Nothing of any real substance was really passed during his presidency. It was under Madison that the United States declared war on Great Britain over the rights of neutrals to engage in freedom of the seas. It's really important to remember at this time that that the Atlantic Ocean is such a key factor in American history. I feel like we don't really think of that. I think of it as that today, but at the time it was such a key detail, and not only news, how news traveled between different powers of the time, but also how, with this whole issue of mercantilism, how goods are passed between the United States and Great Britain at the time as well. During the Chesapeake campaign of the war, Madison was actually on the battlefield in Maryland in 1814, where the American army was routed by the British. Madison and then those living in Washington fled the city, and the British captured it and then put a lot of public buildings to the torch, as we mentioned earlier. So I guess you know a little bit about the War of 1812. What would you say was Did Madison really do anything for the war or like the war effort? Was he a good commander-in-chief?
I don't know much about his battlefield command. For his grand strategy, trying to take territory in Canada, a little bit ambitious. I mean, the country had only been together for a couple decades at this point, and you're trying to take on, Great Britain's last remaining colonial possession in North America. It's going to be tougher than you think. Like, as Canadians today like to remind Americans that yes, they did march on Washington, they did burn down the White House. So, there was a victory in New Orleans after peace had been signed, but I don't know how much credit Madison can take for that.
Right.
I question his role as a strategic commander, and I feel like trying to take Canada was a little ambitious.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I think, I'm not really sure if James Madison ever really wanted to be president. He really loved, like I said, he was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. And even during his own presidency, the first Secretary of State that he nominated, I don't have the name in front of me at this moment, but the first one that he nominated, barely ever did his job. And so during his own presidency, Madison kind of had to take over the role of Secretary of State because nothing was being done. So I think really you can say that, of course, he was all of these things, right? He was Commander-in-Chief. He was President of the United States for 8 years. He, wrote the Constitution, but I think his true, passion, which kind of comes up again and again over, all this information that I've read about Madison. His true passion was really the Secretary of State position, which is just the president's chief foreign affairs advisor. So I guess, maybe that's one of the things that maybe public historians can focus on him more. Is just his love for foreign affairs and kind of being like this, kind of stepping in the shoes of Ben Franklin and even Thomas Jefferson, just how foreign affairs was really deemed as the highest importance of the era. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think I hadn't considered that, but I was wondering if he got elected in the first place because he was a founding father and designed the Constitution. If you're running against somebody who wrote the document that the country is operating on, it's kind of hard to win. Yeah, no, I agree. But it is interesting that he seemed to I feel like he'd been perfectly happy if he didn't get elected and just stayed Secretary of State for his entire political career. Yeah. From what you've been saying, it seems like that was really where his passions were. I don't know how Montpelier deals with this on their tours, but it'd be interesting to kind of focus in on that. Rather than being someone who wants to run the country, he'd rather deal with how other countries interact with the United States. I feel like that would be, at least for me, maybe that's the historian in me talking, but that would be very interesting.
It's, when I've talked about Montpelier a little bit today, but Montpelier really does not, and of course everything fluctuates depending on who you get as a tour guide. Yes. And I think that's very important when we talk about founding fathers' houses and tours at their plantations. It's really difficult. Of course, every house tries to figure out this main narrative that they want every single guest to get at those houses, but it seems like the narrative that they talk about at the house is like Madison really did not enjoy necessarily being president, which checks out because he is seen wavering on many huge issues of the time. Like I said, he has to take over the Secretary of State job. So they say he did not enjoy being president, but also I think he loved being at Montpelier, but he usually stayed just scribbling in his room. I think really his few joys in life were writing. Of course, he's a great writer. He has many different documents from his life that he has written, but just spending time with Thomas Jefferson, I think, is one of his few joys in life. And I don't know, it's they definitely struggle with a narrative at the house.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I understand, because when you have a person as difficult for even historians to talk about as Madison, of course the house is going to have issues with kind of portraying this idea of Madison.
It's not as easy, compared to Thomas Jefferson. The guy was extroverted and eccentric. Like,
right.
He's serving mac and cheese at White House state dinners, and I can't imagine Madison enjoy hosting any sort of party, whether it's at Montpelier or the White House. As an introvert, that parties are just not. Like you said, he probably would have snuck up to a study and scribbled away, but.
Well, and that's really interesting you bring that up, because even during his presidency, like, he was not known for whining and dining anybody, like, at the White House, as one of the first, if not the first, presidents to live in the White House. He was not really the host that many presidents are expected to be. His wife, Dolly, actually took that role and expanded it, and I think she's kind of like what a lot of first ladies like modeled themselves after. After her time in that position. But no, I think she was always known for like throwing the parties while he would be away, tucked away somewhere, like doing something else. But I guess kind of like talking about, kind of switching tangents a little bit. Montpelier has been pretty much a failure in the public history sphere. Particularly in the past 2 years, really. It's been really recent that his, some of these issues with his plantation has come up, particularly in relation to other founders' plantations. Monticello has its own issues. I will say that.
Oh, yeah.
But I think probably the most successful of all of them would be Mount Vernon, as interesting as that is. And of course, George Washington, it's so interesting because if you look at figures like George Washington and you look at, one of his counterparts, one of his cohort members, if you will, James Madison, they have very similar lives, right? Maybe grown up differently, right? George Washington had more probably physical jobs in his lifetime than Madison ever did, but also George Washington was 6'2" and
great big tall guy.
Yeah. George Washington was also commander-in-chief. Obviously, the first president. Had many slaves, many more than Madison, I believe. Yet Mount Vernon is a success, and doesn't have the same struggle element as Montpelier does. And I guess, would you put all of that blame on the fact of the Madison problem, or would you say that it's he's just not as iconic as George Washington?
I think you can make the case for both. Washington, like you said, first president, commander-in-chief. He had an extensive military career with the British before the Revolution. I don't know if Madison had any sort of military career prior to the Revolution. So, Washington's got a lot of good things going for him, for, his career checklist, so to speak. It also helps that I believe it's the Mount Vernon Women's Association really kept the house and the plantation alive until it became a national park. Also, Mount Vernon has this great view looking over the Potomac River.
That's true.
It's got gardens, greenhouses, lots of different places to go. There's the distillery is still there. So there's a lot of different aspects that Mount Vernon can go with their programming. It also helps that, Washington is buried on the property, and that attracts a lot of people every year.
I didn't even think about that.
So it's not only U.S. visitors, it's foreign visitors as well, because D.C.'s right across the river.
Right.
So
that makes sense. I've never been to Mount Vernon. That's not obvious. Been to Monticello and Montpelier, but not Mount Vernon. It's beautiful, though.
It is very beautiful.
I've seen pictures.
Yeah. So Mount Vernon's kind of got the threefold of Washington's career, the Mount Vernon Women's Association, and the geographic location going for it. Like it's in a good spot. Like they've got a lot they can do with it.
Yeah.
And I think with Madison, his career after the Constitution is kind of, I guess you could say, mediocre.
Yeah.
He doesn't really do anything notable in his presidency, or his other political aspects or political life after that. Like you said, Montpelier is kind of tucked away in the trees. There's no scenic view like over the Potomac River or over, Albemarle County or Charlottesville. And, Madison wrote a lot, but there's not, he's not as outgoing and, I don't want to say eccentric, but, Thomas Jefferson has he writes a lot, he does a lot of crazy things, the swivel chair, bringing macaroni and cheese to the White House. Like, there's a lot of stuff that Jefferson's life you can draw upon. I feel like Madison, maybe because he is an introvert, there's not a lot you can really use to draw people in. And the biggest thing with these houses is you've got to make money. You have to get people there somehow, and you've got to make money. And you can do that easily with Monticello because, in addition to Jefferson in his life, you also have the architecture of the house. And UVA's right there as well. And now I know they're doing a better job with enslaved narratives as well. And Mount Vernon, D.C., Washington's life with Madison and Montpelier, not a whole lot that's really drawing people in unless they're like die-hard James Madison fans,
Yeah. A little funny story. When I did go visit Montpelier last fall, I went with my good friends Subat Mateen and Karen Liu, and it was Constitution Day. We unintentionally went on Constitution Day. I think you know this story.
I think so.
I think.
Yeah.
And we did not know it was Constitution Day, but we showed up nonetheless for Dr. Dillard's class because he had assigned us all different plantation houses of the time period to go to.
Yeah, different historic sites around the state he wanted us to kind of investigate and then report on.
For the time period. And so we had to come back with reports detailing notes. It was a really fun project, actually. Yeah. I really enjoyed those. We did those kind of for every era, because then we had to do an antebellum one, and then we had to do one like
closer to the Civil War, I think.
Yes, that's correct. So really, really fun projects. But so Karen Liu, Subat Mateen, and I went on Constitution Day, and it was pretty empty, even though they had really hyped up Constitution Day, apparently in the local media, in the local newspaper. There was a newspaper photographer there, and very quickly he took our group picture together, and we were in the paper a few days later, I think as the diversity highlights, to be honest with you. But I think the house, and lots of people have talked about issues with the house, and why it struggles so much, and most recently the issues with the house have been that the administration does not really want to work with the descendants of color from the enslaved population who lived there once upon a time, and a lot of the archaeologists have been fired for wanting to maintain those ties with the African American descendants. And I feel like it is such a mistake to not only fire your archaeologists who have worked there for a decade, but also just, and we talk about this of course in class a lot, but as this is a public facing project, it is so important to have both elements of the big man like James Madison, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, but also to have those same voices from the enslaved communities who existed there. Because what if we erase that part, what are we left with? You know?
Yeah.
Like, it's not just, you know, I feel like they're not just fumbling the legacy of Madison, but they're also just fumbling the legacy of all of those who lived there. And those voices are so important to maintain.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to forget what happened there. It's important to keep those around, and I know that's like an obvious statement probably. But how, you know, how can historians work with, you know, administration and houses to kind of, I know that's a difficult question to answer, but like, how can we better work with people or better explain like what our purpose is to people who don't, you know, maybe want to reckon with that history, and to make it relevant at the same time.
Right. I have not worked for a public house or house museum, so I don't have any personal experience, but I can kind of guess that there's sort of a split between admin and staff when it comes to profit. You know, unless these sites are like national landmarks, admin is always going to be wondering or focusing on making a profit, whereas the staff and the historians are going to be focused on telling the history and telling the stories that are relevant and that people want to hear. And I think Montpelier has a unique opportunity to discuss like the history of slavery in the Republic, the early Republic, you know, because you have Madison, who one day is anti-slavery, the next day is pro-slavery, and you know, Dolly Madison, who benefits from the, you know, the luxurious lifestyle that's afforded to her, and you know, Madison saying that he would rather not have to rely on enslaved people in order to live. So they have a unique opportunity to kind of discuss that debate within the Constitutional Convention and within the Constitution itself, and you know, bring in descendant communities and all sorts of things, but nothing's happening on that front.
No, I completely agree with you. I feel like out of all of the founders, even Jefferson included, I think Madison's would be so interesting to bring up, like, all these issues. And, you know, to talk about within the house itself too, you know, because when I went and toured the house, there was no discussion of slavery within the 4 rooms that we visited. And, you know, I think they, like you said, it's such a unique opportunity to be able to talk about the wrestling that not just the founders of the New Republic had with slavery or with the moral issues over slavery, but also just the people of America in general all really, you know, wrestled with these notions of slavery and what property of man means, and, you know, living in a nation that perpetuated the idea of owning enslaved people as property. And they could really, I think, do something really special with that and with the time period as well. I know Montpelier doesn't have, like, you know, the nail factory that Monticello and that Thomas Jefferson did, but I think Madison is a difficult character study for sure, as we've kind of talked about through this entire podcast. But he's an interesting one because I feel like it's relatable in a way. If, you know, I think if any of us were really to the introverted ones of us were to become like in that high level of office, it would be really difficult to make hard, you know, decisions about moral things of the time, especially when you're thinking about of the time period, right? So all of these individuals, and a lot, even Northerners in the United States at the time, were pro-slavery. It's not as, you know, split up as we like to think. You know, this isn't the 1850s, 1860s where, slavery is illegal in most of the North,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this huge divide between the North and the South. I mean, lots of northern states still had slavery that existed
Mm-hmm.
in the North, and lots of people were slaveholders in the North. So it wasn't this sectioned thing. It was the whole nation was really struggling with this idea,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Montpelier would. I know some people. It's hard to make people care
Yeah.
about that. And I think as educators, I think the best thing we can do is, have people within programs like our program and within the public education sphere that are passionate about it, and are passionate about explaining it in a way that makes sense.
Right.
I know, that's one really important thing for me when I'm speaking to my students in class, or even my younger siblings who are in school. When I try to explain certain historical events, I'm like, well, we have to consider A, B, C, and D. It's not, it's not this two-dimensional thing that we can look at and kind of explain to them. We have to explain the whole situation.
Right.
And I don't know, I in some ways I feel bad for Madison, because you said, after he wrote the Constitution, it's okay, that's really the best thing that he does.
He
So young in life.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, Montpelier highlights the fact that he is father of the Constitution. That's probably one of the more important things that they do talk about. But it's also difficult because he doesn't write the Constitution at Montpelier.
Right.
He writes it in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
It's done elsewhere. It's not really done at the house.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, I think, would argue that, or I think a lot of people would argue that James Madison just isn't relevant anymore. So what would you say to people who would say that?
I can kind of see their argument. I can kind of see their point. On the other hand, like we talked about with the house itself, there's a unique opportunity when teaching about Madison to kind of bring in these elements of pro and anti-slavery and early abolition movements as well.
Yes, you're right, because he does inspire kind of that language that they talk about with no property in man, even though that wasn't his intention, but it is something that happens.
So I feel like in teaching Madison, there's that opportunity to kind of plant the seeds, or show that the seeds are being planted for abolition movements.
Yeah.
And that's a way to teach Madison without, kind of compromising on, the shades of gray that are, 18th and 19th century historical figures.
Yeah. No, that's a really great answer, actually. That's something they did not do in the house when I toured. But I think you're absolutely right. They could talk about how, he unintentionally kind of inspired ways in which early anti-slavery movements in the U.S. based their own arguments off of. And I think, I don't know, it's just disappointing that the house could do so much more.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not a bottom-up issue, it's a top-down issue, particularly with Montpelier. So what I'm going to end on today, and for this podcast specifically, as JMU students, I feel like James Madison's legacy is doubly important to us. I feel like, I don't know, JMU isn't really it's not a UVA, right? We don't have to deal with as much memory issues as UVA does,
right,
pertaining to Thomas Jefferson. Or even Washington and Lee, we were just talking about earlier,
yes,
gets a lot of heat because of, Robert E. Lee's ties with the college. But still, JMU has a lot of interesting ties to the Confederacy and to, kind of the slave holding notions that we were kind of talking about earlier. So because of that, I'm going to read a portion of an update from our school's president, Dr. Alger, Dr. Jonathan R. Alger, who in 2020 he announced an update on building names across campus. A couple of buildings in the quad, in the middle part of our campus. Essentially, we had 3 different halls on campus that were named to honor individuals who fought for the Confederacy. Those were Jackson, Ashby, and Maury halls on campus. The history department at JMU actually used to be housed in Jackson Hall, named for Stonewall Jackson. So I'm going to read a little bit of what he says. Much has changed since those renamings occurred in the early 20th century. The names of those original buildings were changed from what they had been previously to recognize those individuals from the Confederacy, and that was in the early 1900s or the early 20th century. We evolved into a comprehensive and fully co-educational institution that welcomes students from all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. As an institution of higher education, our mission includes a responsibility to change and evolve in ways that reflects the needs and circumstances of our society and our people. In other words, change is built into our DNA, just as it is built into the DNA of our nation. So he then goes on to mention how different perspectives need to be heard and examined, and action sometimes has to come from that. And he describes this as, us, the nation being part of a democratic society, just as the school runs as a democratic society. And the student population at the time voted to change the names in 2020 to update them from what they had been previously. So, we have heard from thousands of people who have shared their thoughts and perspectives. Indeed, many people have shared that they learned about the history and context of these buildings for the first time through this process, and noted that this learning has caused them to reflect and change their minds. In other words, our university has modeled its very purpose and mission. We know that these names are a painful reminder of a history of oppression, and that they send an unwelcoming message to Black students, faculty, and staff in particular. That is not who we are, nor who we want to be. We embrace values of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and we know that we become a better and stronger educational institution as we strive to live out those values. Speaking of history, we have received a number of inquiries from alumni and friends of the university asking whether removing James Madison from the name of the institution is under active consideration. It is not. It is certainly true that James Madison himself owned slaves during his lifetime, and as an institution we have taken important steps to tell the full history of Madison and his times. We recognize his flaws as well as his virtues, a combination that describes all of us, in our times as well as his. But that is not the reason why his legacy is honored through the name of this university. The university itself was renamed for James Madison because he is internationally recognized as the father of the U.S. Constitution and the primary author of the Bill of Rights, which have served as the very framework for democracy in our country and as a model for nations all around the world. Indeed, without Madison's life work, we might not have been able to have this conversation today. This legacy is also critical to our DNA as a nation, and to our DNA as an educational institution in which we value freedom of expression. That legacy is not just about history. Madison and his colleagues knew that their new nation was imperfect, and they developed a system built on the assumption that every ensuing generation would need to continue the hard work of building a more just society that reflects the ideal embodied in the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That is the high calling that challenges and inspires us now. That's not the end of the letter, but I feel like that's definitely the most powerful part of the letter. Have you ever read that before?
I have not read that before.
What are your immediate thoughts, if I can ask?
I think it does a good job of acknowledging the shades of gray we've kind of been talking about. Is it Dr. Alger? Is that his title?
I would just call him President. I'm
Okay.
actually not sure if he has a PhD or not.
If you're reading this, President Alger, I'm sorry. Or listening to this, I'm sorry.
So President, I'll go by President Alger.
He acknowledges that Madison did own slaves, which is a good thing. It needs to be acknowledged. But he also acknowledged that he is the father of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that is, like you said, internationally recognized, and that is the foundation of our country. So I think the letter does a good job of kind of acknowledging the sort of requests and inquiries that the school received, but also saying that, even though we're named after an imperfect man, what he wrote is pushing us to be better. So
I really like specifically what he says about we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, how this is kind of a calling or a challenge to every American, right, that has existed since the founding. That they couldn't you can't make it perfect on the first try.
No.
And I don't think anyone really expected them to do so.
No.
And as we know explicitly, like, they didn't do it perfectly.
No.
Not even in the first 100 years of the nation.
Yeah.
Maybe not even the first 200 years of the nation. And we're not perfect today.
Right.
But it is, I think, a challenge, to us politically. And I think he's right. It is, critical to our DNA as a nation, and critical to the DNA of the school as well. I don't think they should change the name.
No, it's I don't think they should change it either. The United States, I've heard it referred to as the greatest experiment in democracy the world's ever seen. Like, in experiments, it doesn't always go right, like you said. So, I think that changing the name would be a mistake.
Yeah.
One, because that's one less thing for people to kind of recognize James Madison. Like, having a university named after you helps people kind of like, oh, who is James Madison? On the other hand, for a practical matter, rebranding an entire university is far too expensive.
Right. Changing all the signs and
stationery, paperwork.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think also, and he kind of, I didn't read this part, but the very last portion of President Alger's speech, he says, "As we move forward, we might ask ourselves, how will history judge us? How will people 100 years from now look back on how we have treated one another, how we have worked together, and what we have accomplished?" And I think that's also an important charge. It's easy to look back to events that happened over 200 years ago, and and think, wow, like, they were really in the wrong for this. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that owning slaves is okay. Obviously, just to make myself very clear.
Right. I
can't say really whether or not James Madison could have done much to, improve his legacy while he was alive. I think that's really difficult. It's hard to look back, or it's easy to look back and say, oh, you could have changed this, and this. You could have changed, you could have not challenged England during the War of 1812 and, hurt the nation even more by burning many of the buildings in D.C. I'm sure that was not a great look on his part. It wasn't a great look on his part, actually, from my own research. And just his failure as a president. But it's easy to look back on those things and say, oh, you did A, B, and C wrong. But I think genuinely he tried to do the right thing for what he knew was the right thing. And I think one could argue that he knew that owning slaves was morally incorrect, and he did not free them. But it was a different time. Like, and it's important. It's really important to remember that, and it's important to teach that as well.
Do we need to decide if he's the asshole or
Oh,
not?
yeah. Let's do that. So what do you think?
He's such a complex figure. I don't think I can justify him being an asshole in this situation. looking back, like you had talked about, hindsight is 20/20.
Right.
You can point out very obvious places where he made mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put yourself in his shoes, and his personality is very introverted and reclusive, and the decisions he had to make, I don't think you can fault him for what he did. So I don't think he's the asshole in this situation.
I've also come to that conclusion, I think, as well, over talking with you about it. I think he is not the asshole in this situation. Actually, after this whole project, after doing research on it, I actually kind of feel bad for how he's viewed today in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he is very much a forgotten figure,
Yeah.
And that I know there were other people who were in the Constitutional Convention that hardly anybody remembers their names, but Madison,
Right.
being one of the more preeminent members of the convention, has unfortunately fallen by the wayside.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. Well, I guess Thomas Jefferson is more easily recognized for a lot of different reasons, which you've already mentioned. I think also Jefferson was kind of a weirdo.
He's a little bit weird.
If you go visit his house, he's got some interesting things going on in the house. And Madison wasn't really an inventor like Jefferson necessarily. So I think Madison's definitely more normal than Jefferson.
Yeah.
But I think because of that normalcy, he's very often overlooked. And I agree with you. I think it's unfortunate how it's difficult for historians to really pinpoint, other than the Constitution, something that he's known for, or ways in which he really changed the trajectory of American history. But I think one of the ways in which he did change the trajectory of American history was just being one of those Enlightenment thinkers.
Yes.
And you could also argue that being an Enlightenment thinker, being inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, that's just another reason why he shouldn't have owned slaves, and I agree with that, to a point. But I also think if not for Madison, where would we be?
Right.
Who would have written the Constitution? What, without him, would we have had that property and man statement in the Constitution?
Right.
So I don't know. It's hard to imagine what the United States would look like without him. But he, unfortunately, with his life and legacy and his house, he's largely forgotten.
Yeah. All right. I think we're recording.
Okay. There it is.
You got this.
Okay.
Yeah, just having a conversation.
Yeah, just a conversation. Just a very important conversation that directs my entire GPA for the semester.
No pressure. No pressure.
Yeah, that's fine. Regardless, I certainly had a hand in fuck. Fuck. Okay.
Take two.
Okay. Regardless.
Okay, we're still going.
Sorry.
Oh, man.
I was you can keep going, but I don't know what's happening.
Where was I?
I have no idea.
Can we start again? Wait, hold on.
And later, in a published work called Vices of the Political System of the United States, he says, where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more... maybe I should look up how to say that. Giuseppe.
Just put some music over this, Giuseppe.
Fallacious?
But that's my best guess.
Fallacious?
Maybe throw that into Google Translate and see what they say. Let's see if you can listen to it.
Fallacious.
Okay, I was right. Okay, hold on.